I've never been one for sports, really. I've made no bones about that throughout my life. But there are moments in sports that become larger than the game, larger than championships, larger than statistics, even larger than the people who lived through them. They become cautionary tales that refuse to fade because they force us to confront how quickly self control can completely disappear. On August 22nd of 1965, two of baseball's greatest teams met in San Francisco with first place hanging in the balance. By the end of the afternoon, one player would be bleeding from his head and another would carry regret for the rest of his life. And an entire generation would remember exactly where the baseball game crossed that line that could never be erased. Join me today as I follow the chain of events, the chain of decisions that led from one swing of a ball bat to explore why one of baseball's darkest afternoons ultimately became one of its most remarkable and darkest stories. So, the rivalry between the San Francisco Giants and the Los Angeles Dodgers had already been burning for decades before anyone even stepped onto the field that afternoon. It had begun in New York and survived a cross-country move to California and only seemed to intensify with time. By late August of 1965, every single game carried enormous weight. The Dodgers entered the day in first place, with the Giants close behind in one of the tightest pennant races baseball had ever seen. The Milwaukee Braves, the Cincinnati Reds, and the Pittsburgh Pirates were still all close enough to matter, but everyone understood that the real battle was unfolding between San Francisco and Los Angeles, longtime rivals. The atmosphere around Candlestick Park that day reflected this. The crowd was loud before the first pitch, the players were tense before the first inning, and neither side intended to give way, even the smallest advantage. The pitching matchup alone would have sold every single seat in the stadium. Juan Marichal, I'm sorry, like I said, I don't follow baseball, so if I mispronounce these names, there's a pretty good reason for that. But Juan Marichal took to the mound for the Giants. He was famous for his high leg kick. He had remarkable control, and he had fierce determination. Opposing him was Sandy Koufax, whose brilliance had already become the standard by which many pitchers were judged. There were not simply talented athletes on this field. They were competitors trusted to carry their teams through the biggest moments of this entire season. The game opened with Dodgers shortstop Maury Wills dropping a bunt. It was a perfectly legal baseball play that Marichal nevertheless viewed as an unnecessary challenge. Wills eventually scored, and something inside the Giants' ace began to kind of tighten up. When Wills returned to bat in the second inning, Marichal answered with a brushback pitch that sent him sprawling into the dirt. It was baseball's oldest language, spoken without words, but everyone understood who happened to be watching that day. Marichal was pissed. So the Dodgers responded almost immediately. Koufax threw high near Willie Mays. That's a famous name. It wasn't to injure him, but it was to answer what was already being said. Then Marichal came back and inside against Juan Fairley, forcing him to dive away from another fastball. This was going back and forth astonishingly quickly and brutally. Home plate umpire Shag Crawford stepped forward and warned both benches that any further retaliation would not be tolerated. Warnings have a curious way of sounding final until emotions start leading people otherwise. Inside the Dodgers dugout, Koufax reportedly asked the catcher John Roseboro who should be hit next. Roseboro understood what was at stake with these words. The Dodgers could not afford to lose Koufax to an ejection or to a suspension in the middle of a pennant race. So he answered that he would take care of it himself. It was a simple exchange, almost forgettable at the time, but it would become one of the most important conversations of the afternoon later on. When Marichal came to the bat in the bottom of the third inning, he expected another pitch to come dangerously close, and instead, Koufax threw normally. After the second pitch, Roseboro caught the ball and fired it back toward the mound. Whether the throw actually brushed Marichal's ear or merely passed close enough for him to feel the error, that's been debated ever since, but Marichal believed it had been deliberately intended to hit him. He immediately turned toward Roseboro and demanded to know why. Roseboro rose from his crouch and he stepped forward. What happened during the next few seconds has been remembered from countless angles, but one fact has never changed. The pitcher still held his bat. For just a heartbeat, everything seemed suspended. 22 men, thousands of spectators, one pennant race, one baseball field there at Candlestick Park. No one could yet know that what happened over the next few seconds would become one of the most infamous moments in the short history of the sport. History happens when ordinary decisions collide with extraordinary consequences, and sometimes the distance between the two is no wider than the length of, say, a baseball bat. So Marichal never dropped the bat. Roseboro never stepped back. In the span of between one heartbeat and the next, the pitcher swung, striking the Dodgers catcher on the head purposefully. Then he struck again. Now you know it was personal and on purpose. A deep cut opened across Roseboro's scalp, and blood began running down his face pretty much immediately. For an instant, thousands of people inside a Candlestick Park seemed unable to really process what they had just witnessed. It's hard to do that when you're witnessing an incredible act of violence like this. I don't know if you've ever been in that kind of a situation, but at first you think to yourself, did I just see that right? Surely not. But then it happens again. Yeah, you saw that right. It's time to do something about it. So baseball players expected hard slides and bruises and broken fingers. Even the occasional fist fight, sure, but they did not expect a bat to become a weapon on the field in front of a whole lot of people. This almost looked like attempted murder. Sandy Koufax sprinted from the mound, not to join the fight, but to stop it. Willie Mays rushed toward the scene for the exact same reason. Umpires, coaches, players, all these people poured onto the field until the infield became a moving mass of uniforms and shouting and absolute pandemonium and confusion. For 14 long minutes, the game disappeared beneath the weight of raw human emotion and anger. When order was finally restored, Marichal had been ejected. Roseboro was being taken away for medical treatment, and everyone left standing understood that they had crossed into a territory that baseball had rarely ever seen before. The remarkable part is that the game resumed like nothing had happened almost. Roseboro was gone. He received 14 stitches to close the massive wound in his gaping head, while Koufax returned to the mound after helping to separate this fight. Even one of the greatest pitchers in history looked shaken. He walked 2 batters before Willie Mays drove a 3-run home run into the stands. That means the bases were loaded, and yeah. Anyway, this move would end up giving San Francisco a lead that they would not end up surrendering. And the Giants won the game 4-3. But by the time the final out was recorded, the score had become almost irrelevant. Reporters were no longer talking about the pitching duels or the pennant races. They were asking how something like this act of violence could happen between 2 future Hall of Famers in the middle of a baseball game. Sometimes one moment overwhelms absolutely everything that comes before it, and the rest of the day becomes little more than a footnote to that famous moment. The punishment came quickly. National League President Warren Giles suspended Marichal for 8 games. He fined him then a record $1,750, which doesn't seem like much today, but in 1965, that was a hefty chunk of change. And then he barred him from traveling to Dodger Stadium for the final crucial series of the season. Roseboro filed a lawsuit seeking damages before the two men eventually reached a financial settlement outside of court. Fans argued across the country that the suspension was either too harsh or too lenient, but the Giants could not escape the effect. Marichal was missed for 2 stats during one of the closest pennant races in baseball, forcing the rest of the pitching staff to carry the entire burden. Although San Francisco played brilliantly during the portions of his absence, the Dodgers caught fire late in the season, winning 15 of their final 16 games. When the standings were final, Los Angeles had captured the pennant by only 2 games. Willie Mays would later admit that he believed Marichal's absence may have made all the difference in the world. One terrible decision became part of the mathematics of an entire season. For years, that swing followed both men. Marichal remained one of the greatest pitchers of his generation, but many baseball writers could not separate his remarkable career from those few violent seconds in August of 1965. When he first became eligible for the Hall of Fame, he was passed over despite the statistics that ordinarily would have made elections seem pretty much completely inevitable. Roseboro, meanwhile, carried the scars on his head for the rest of his life, but also carried a truth that may have surprised many, many people. In his memoir, he admitted that the throw near Marichal's head had indeed been intentional. He had chosen to retaliate himself because he wanted to protect Koufax from possible ejection or suspension during the pennant race. It didn't excuse what followed, and Roseboro never claimed that it did. Instead, it revealed that the confrontation had been built piece by piece through decisions made on both sides until nobody remembered who had started the chain of events that eventually everyone suffered from where it ended. Then the story took a direction that almost no one expected. During the 1980s, the bitterness slowly gave way to an actual final conversation. Conversation eventually became friendship. Roseboro publicly forgave Marichal and personally appealed to the Hall of Fame voters not to define an extraordinary career by one man's worst moment. And that appeal made a big difference. Marichal was finally elected into the Cooperstown in 1983, and during his induction speech, he thanked the very man that he had once struck with a bat twice. Years later, when Roseboro died, Marichal served as an honorary pallbearer at his funeral. He later said that Johnny's forgiveness was one of the greatest blessings of his entire life, and that he wished Roseboro could have been his catcher. There are many stories about revenge in sports and in life. And there are far fewer stories about forgiveness. And that's why I chose this one. This ending carries more weight than the fight itself. Looking back now, it's tempting to remember only the violence because it's dramatic. It's easy to replay. It's easy to see these photos, and it's impossible to ignore. But the deeper lesson lives beyond the headlines. These two proud competitors allowed one afternoon of absolute sheer rage and anger to define them until they chose many years later to write a completely different ending together. That choice did not erase the blood, the suspension, the regret, the stitches, the pain. But it did prove that a person's worst moment does not have to become the final chapter or the defining moment. Baseball recorded the statistics, but history remembered the fight. Character was measured by everything that happened afterward. So if somebody sincerely accepts responsibility for their worst mistake, and spends years proving that they have changed, do you believe they deserve to be remembered for the mistake or for the person they became? Does it matter what that mistake was at that point? Is there a threshold of what mistakes should be forgiven and shouldn't? I know there's a few people in my past that a lot of people are surprised that I have forgiven. I can't forget. And I'll never befriend them. These two are two remarkable men. But I forgave the man that trafficked me because I can't hold on to that anger and that pain anymore. But a lot of people are surprised by that. Anyway, thanks for watching.